Welcome to Briefing 6 of 6 of the CipherVibe Cybersecurity for Beginners course. Today, we will make Intel hardware root of trust and silicon-level attacks understandable, practical, and connected to the rest of your learning path. Modern processors predict and execute work speculatively for performance, then discard architecturally incorrect results, but microarchitectural traces can sometimes leak information across boundaries. The correct response is not to declare silicon trust dead. It is to understand affected processor families, deploy coordinated mitigations, verify attestation state, and reduce exposure where isolation assumptions are strongest. The purpose of this lesson is not to memorize a collection of terms. It is to build a mental model you can apply when tools, platforms, and threats change. We will define the core ideas, walk through a repeatable defensive workflow, examine mistakes that frequently mislead beginners, design useful safeguards, and finish with a safe portfolio exercise. Throughout the course, remember that security work begins with authorization, scope, and evidence. Use the exercises only on local systems you own or environments you have explicit written permission to assess. Pause when you need to. Write concepts in your own words, record observations, and distinguish what the evidence proves from what you are merely assuming. That habit is more valuable than rushing through another tool demonstration. Start with 4 concepts that provide the vocabulary for Intel hardware root of trust and silicon-level attacks. First, a hardware root of trust anchors measurements, keys, boot verification, isolated execution, or attestation in components intended to be harder to subvert than ordinary software. Second, transient execution attacks manipulate prediction or execution behavior and infer protected data through caches or other microarchitectural side effects. Third, mitigations may require microcode, firmware, operating system, hypervisor, compiler, runtime, or application changes, and their effectiveness depends on configuration and processor model. Fourth, remote attestation reports measurements and security version information so a relying party can apply policy. It does not guarantee that every undiscovered side channel is absent. Do not study these as isolated definitions. Ask which asset or business service is involved, where the relevant trust boundary sits, which identity performs the action, and what reliable evidence would show that the control worked. Security reasoning is a chain. Source evidence supports an observation. The observation supports a conclusion. The conclusion informs a proportionate decision. The decision has an owner, an expected result, and a way to verify it. When any link is missing, say so. A professional explanation can include uncertainty without becoming vague. For example, a network record may prove that 2 addresses communicated, but it may not prove which human initiated the action or whether the content was malicious. Use diagrams whenever a relationship is difficult to explain in a sentence. Mark identities, systems, data flows, boundaries, and controls. A simple, accurate diagram is more useful than a crowded picture that implies knowledge you do not have. Now turn the mental model into a repeatable workflow. First, the attacker first gains the local execution conditions, coresidency, privilege, or code path required by the specific microarchitectural technique. Second, carefully shaped branches, indirect targets, buffers, or prediction history influence transient execution beyond the intended architectural path. Third, although the processor later discards the transient result, observable timing or cache effects can encode information from another protection domain. Fourth, the defender identifies affected processor models, workload boundaries, enabled features, advisory prerequisites, and the exact firmware and software mitigation chain. Fifth, after deployment, teams verify microcode, kernel or hypervisor settings, attestation collateral, performance effects, and residual risk for sensitive tenants. Before acting, define the objective, scope, owner, and success condition. Collect the smallest amount of trustworthy evidence needed to understand the situation. Preserve timestamps and sources so another person can follow your reasoning. Priorities should be explainable. Consider exposure, identity and privilege, sensitive data, business importance, exploit conditions, existing safeguards, reversibility, and confidence. A dramatic label should never replace that analysis. The workflow does not end when a command succeeds, a ticket closes, or a dashboard turns green. Verify the new state with fresh evidence. Check for recurrence and for side effects introduced by the change. Document the result in plain language: what you observed, what you concluded, what you changed, who approved it, what evidence confirms the outcome, and what uncertainty remains. This disciplined loop, observe, interpret, decide, act, verify, and learn, appears in every cybersecurity specialty. Understanding failure modes will protect you from attractive but unreliable shortcuts. First, treating every speculative execution disclosure as remote code execution exaggerates impact and hides the prerequisites that determine real exposure. Second, applying an operating system update without the required microcode, firmware, hypervisor, or configuration change can leave mitigation incomplete. Third, assuming a confidential computing label removes all shared hardware risk ignores the attested trusted computing base and product-specific advisories. Fourth, disabling mitigations for performance without workload-specific threat modeling can restore cross-domain leakage risk. Fifth, unsupported end-of-service processors may not receive evaluation or mitigation, creating long-lived exposure in forgotten infrastructure. These mistakes often share one cause: confusing an available signal with a complete explanation. A tool can report a finding, a successful action, or a score while important scope, context, ownership, and verification remain missing. Avoid absolute claims. Words such as secure, compromised, fixed, and compliant require scope and evidence. Prefer precise statements such as, "This control blocked the tested path under these conditions," or, "The available records show this identity used the service," but do not identify the human operator. Also resist copying commands without understanding their inputs, outputs, permissions, and side effects. Run one controlled change at a time and record what happened. If an exercise does not behave as expected, that is useful evidence. Stop, inspect the environment, revise the hypothesis, and explain the difference. Good security work is not a performance of certainty, it is careful reasoning under imperfect information. Reliable security uses layers because no single control can prevent every failure. First, maintain processor model inventory and map Intel advisories to firmware, microcode, hypervisor, operating system, and confidential computing dependencies. Second, prioritize multi-tenant, hostile code, browser, sandbox, virtual machine, enclave, and high-value cryptographic workloads according to attack prerequisites. Third, deploy vendor mitigations as a tested stack, confirm they are active, record performance effects, and prohibit unreviewed disablement. Fourth, use workload isolation, dedicated hosts for exceptional secrets, least privilege, code signing, sandboxing, and reduced co-residency where residual risk remains. Fifth, validate attestation security versions and trusted computing base recovery so outdated platforms can be rejected or quarantined by policy. For each important risk, ask 5 questions. What makes the event less likely? What evidence would reveal it? Who can contain it? How will trustworthy operation be restored? Who owns the decision and accepts remaining risk? Least privilege applies to people, applications, devices, automation, data stores, and administrators. Access should be scoped, separated, monitored, reviewed, and removed when it is no longer needed. Every important control needs a test strategy. Include representative normal activity, negative cases, misuse, dependency failure, and rollback. A written policy is not evidence that a technical or operational control works. Design for humans. A safeguard that is impossible to use correctly will be bypassed. Provide safe defaults, understandable messages, usable recovery, and clear escalation. Finally, preserve the evidence trail from observation through decision, action, and verification. That history supports investigations, audits, lessons learned, and honest measurement. Turn this briefing into an action plan. First, inventory processor families, firmware, microcode, hypervisors, operating systems, and confidential computing use. Second, cross-reference Intel's affected processor tables and product advisories against the actual fleet. Third, patch representative systems, verify active mitigations and attestation state, and measure performance before broad rollout. Fourth, isolate or retire unsupported hardware and workloads whose secrecy requirements exceed the residual protection. Fifth, continuously monitor new research and advisories because silicon, firmware, and software mitigations evolve together. Make the work measurable. Useful indicators for this topic include processor inventory coverage, systems on required microcode, mitigation state verified, attestation policies current, and unsupported high-risk hosts retired. Define the owner, source, review frequency, and limitation for every measure. Do not treat a product purchase or a single patch as completion. Retest the end-to-end trust path, preserve evidence, and track exceptions until the risk is demonstrably reduced. The broader lesson is that modern security failures cross layers: identity, software, infrastructure, hardware, operations, and governance. Defenders need an architecture that remains trustworthy when one layer fails. For the primary source links and chapter markers, open the description. For more evidence-based cybersecurity research, Visit CipherVibe.com/news and subscribe to CipherVibe. CipherVibe is operated by CloudSecTech LLC. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. This briefing is general education. Never test a system without explicit written authorization.